I want to know, when you need alone time, where do you like to go? I went to a lake. Sometimes when you need space by yourself, maybe you're thinking getting away. It could be even nearby, though. When you need space by yourself, where do you like to go? When you're overwhelmed and you're tired and you're exhausted, where do you like to go? Or maybe you're thinking in a different direction. When I'm angry and I need alone time, where do you like to go? When you need a good cry, where do you like to go? When you're just peopled out and you'd like to go somewhere where you don't see other people, where do you like to go? I'm going to give you a moment, and I'll have you stand and turn to someone in a different row than you and tell them your answer. For our friends online, I want you to say your answers in the comments, whether you're watching live or after the fact, because this is part of community. So go ahead, and today we're beginning a series called Pray Like You Need It, because we all need prayer. And yet so often in our lives, we live as if we're self-sufficient. We live as if we believe we actually could have it all together on our own. It's a little bit funny because if we're honest, none of us could. And today, we're specifically talking about what does it mean to pray when you're hurting? How does it mean to pray when you're going through something? This is not a time for polite prayers. When you're hurting, when you're going through something, when your marriage is falling apart, it's not a time to say, "Dear God, it would be kind of nice if you would do something." When you just received devastating news, that's not a time to say, "Holy God, I'd like it if you could improve my situation just a little bit." It doesn't connect at that point. When you're about to lose everything, you want to cry out, "God, where are you? God, do something." When you're enduring the unendurable for far too long, and you just want to say, "Enough. God, are you listening?" That's what we're talking about today. As Ashley comes up to read Psalm 77, prepare to hear these cries to God and hear them as if they were coming from your heart. Let's hear these words of Scripture.
Psalm 77 from the Common English Bible. I cry out loud to God so that he can hear me. During the day when I'm in trouble, I look for my Lord. At night, my hands are still outstretched, and I don't grow numb. My whole being refuses to be comforted. I remember God, and I moan. I complain, and my spirit grows tired. Selah. You've kept my eyelids from closing. I'm so upset I can't even speak. I think about days long past. I remember years that seem an eternity in the past. I meditate with my heart at night. I complain, and my spirit keeps searching. Will my Lord reject me forever? Will he never be pleased again? Has his faithful love come to a complete end? Is his promise over for future generations? Has God forgotten how to be gracious? Has he angrily stopped up his compassion? Selah. It's my misfortune, I thought, that the strong hand of the Most High is different now. But I will remember the Lord's deeds. Yes, I will remember your wondrous acts from times long past. I will meditate on all your works. I will ponder your deeds. God, your way is holiness. Who is as great a God as you, God? You are the God who works wonders. You have demonstrated your strength among all peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, redeemed the children of Jacob and Joseph. Selah. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and reeled. Even the deep depths shook. The clouds poured water. The skies cracked thunder. Your arrows were flying all around. The crash of your thunder was in the swirling storm. Lightning lit up the whole world. The earth shook and quaked. Your way went straight through the sea. Your pathways went right through the mighty waters, but your footprints left no trace. You led your people like sheep under the care of Moses and Aaron.
You feel the emotion in this verse, in this psalm? So can those words. I cry out loud to God. Out loud to God so that he can hear me. For me, when I need to cry out loud to God like that, I go to the car. I go to the car, close the doors to the car, close the garage door so that no one hears what I shout and yell. It feels so good to yell out the words. Like I could whisper them. God could still hear me, right? There's not really a question about whether God can hear, but to say them out loud. God, this is hard. God, this hurts. God, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Do you know the feeling of struggling with something and it consumes your thoughts all day long? Do you know that feeling? Where it's not just this momentarily, oh, I'm frustrated with something, moving on, oh, look, a slice of pizza. Sometimes there is pizza involved. But to have those moments where you're thinking about the struggle everywhere you go. Every song that comes on the radio is about what you're going through. At least it feels that way. And listen how the psalmist expressed that feeling. During the day when I'm in trouble, I look for my Lord. At night, my hands are still outstretched, and they don't even grow numb. My whole being refuses to be comforted. See, Psalm 77 is a really great one to turn to when you have a complaint against God. Just don't expect yourself to move through all the emotions of this psalm in one sitting. It might take months. But the beginning of it tells us, it reminds us, God can handle your yelling. God can handle your complaints. God can handle it when you're crying out to God day and night and you refuse to be comforted. You know what it's like when there's someone who's struggling, they're in pain, they're really going through something, and you want to comfort them. And so you go and you put a hand on their shoulder and they say, no, don't take my pain away. This is just where I am right now. I refuse to be comforted. My whole being does, the psalm says. Have you ever seen someone who's so mad at God that every time they think of God, they feel upset? Psalm 77 says it this way. I remember God and I moan. I complain. My spirit grows tired. Just the thought of God makes me angry. The thought of God makes me shout out, God, if you're there, why haven't you changed this yet? And God just takes it. There's no rebuke. There's no rebuttal. God just takes it. He lets us complain and complain and complain and complain until we've worn ourselves out. I don't think I'm the only one here who's ever complained to God to the point they wore themselves out. This word spirit, my spirit grows tired. This word spirit actually has two different meanings. It could mean spirit or it could mean breath. And I would say in the psalm, the psalmist is probably playing with both meanings. It's both. It's both of them. God, why don't you do something? God, when are you going to fix this? Until finally I'm just out of breath. I have nothing more to say because nothing's changing. And this word Selah, do you know what it means? It's a musical notation. It's a paragraph marker. It marks the end of the stanza. It's a pause. It's a breath. So imagine how this psalm feels. I cry out to God. I cry out to God so God can hear me. And during the day, when I'm in trouble, I look for the Lord. At night, my hands are still outstretched, and they don't grow numb. And my whole being refuses to be comforted. And I complain. And my spirit grows tired. My breath runs out. Selah. And even then, the wrestling match between me and God continues. And God gives me the strength to keep going. You ever feel like, I don't know how I still have the energy to argue with God anymore, to keep working through this anymore, and yet somehow it's there? The psalmist says, you've kept my eyelids from closing. I'm so upset I can't even speak. And I know that God's been so faithful in the past. It just seems like it's been so long now. The way the psalmist says it, I think about days long past. I remember years that seem an eternity in the past. And verse 6, I go round and round with God. I meditate with my heart at night. I complain. My spirit keeps searching. That moment when you say, God, why aren't my prayers working? Verse 7, will the Lord reject me forever? Because that's how it feels like. It's not that God's rejecting you when you're going through it. But it feels like God's rejecting you. Has God's faithful love come to a complete end? The psalmist asks. Is his promise over for future generations? That was just there in the past, but God's not here now. No wonder there are times we act like atheists, myself included. I act as if it's all up to me, and I forget. There's a God who loves me who is here. But sometimes when you're looking at the situation you're in, it's hard to see it. Sometimes people wonder. In fact, the question was asked when we asked you to submit questions of what questions you have about your faith. The question was asked, does prayer actually change anything? And so many people get to that conclusion that prayer just doesn't change anything. God's going to do what God's going to do. And the psalmist meditates and complains and searches and asks God, are you even still good? In verse 9, has God here forgotten how to be gracious? Has God angrily just stopped up his compassion? Almost gives up. It's my misfortune, I thought, that the strong hand of the Most High is different now. And sometimes people go into self-blame. Have you ever seen someone go through something hard and then they start blaming themselves? Maybe if I would have done this, maybe if I would have done that. Maybe I just don't have enough faith and that's why God's not answering my prayer. Maybe I'm using the wrong words. I didn't say in Jesus' name at the end of that. Maybe that's like a magic spell that would cause God to do something. We do treat prayer like a magic spell, you know. That if you say the right words in the right way, you stand on the right foot at the right time, your wish comes true. But prayer doesn't work like that. Because relationships are everything, and prayer is always about relationship. There are people who end their relationship with God because their magic spell didn't work. Their prayer didn't give them their wish. But if we end a relationship with someone because they don't give us or they don't grant our wishes, then what kind of friend are we being? Because prayer is the language of friendship. Prayer is the language of friendship with God. And we have a friend who loves us unconditionally, with a steadfast love. We have a God, our friend, who is all-powerful. And I'm here today telling you that I am confident enough in this friendship to ask for God's help, but that help is not the basis of that friendship. My relationship with God is not like my relationship with Amazon. if I order something from Amazon and Amazon does not deliver, I will break up with Amazon. That's a promise. Amazon and I, we have a transactional relationship. But God and I, we have a friendship. And you don't use your friends the way you use an Amazon account. I have not entered a relationship with God so that I can get something from God. If that's how it works, then God's not really my friend. God's my e-commerce account in the sky. God's just my tool for getting what I want. But God's response to my prayer, it doesn't end my relationship with God. And yet, God does hear our prayers. And we know this. We know this with confidence by looking at our history with God. Look at your life. This is where the psalm shifts. Up until this point, the psalmist has said, God, why don't you hear me? Why don't you answer? Do you just not care anymore? Have you gone down to my prayers? And now at this halfway point in the psalm, the psalmist has a change of heart. But I will remember the Lord's deeds. Yes, I will remember your wondrous acts from times long past. I'm going to tell you, in that moment of pain, it's really hard to get there. If you give yourself time to get to the place to say with the psalmist, I will remember. At Grace, we talk about things like God sightings. These moments where we recognize we've seen God at work here. Why do we need to tell stories of when God is at work? Why do we need to remember? So that we remember what God has done. So we remember the Lord's deeds, as this verse says. And you may have noticed there's a subtle change in the language of this psalm. For most of the psalm, the word used for God was, you saw it in your English text, was God. The word is Elohim in the Hebrew. Elohim means powerful above all gods. It focuses on God's power. But right here at this turning point in the psalm, there's this shift. Instead of Elohim, God, we see the word Lord. Go back to verse 11. In verse 11, that word Lord in all caps, whenever you see in your Bible the word Lord in all caps, it's a cue word to let you know you're seeing a different word. In the Hebrew, there's no vowels. It's just YHWH. And so you hear different groups of Christians translate it a different way. They had such respect as the Hebrew people for this name for God. This is such a special name for God. They didn't put any vowels in because they wanted to make sure no one said the name of God in vain. This is the special, particular name of God. Sometimes you might hear it pronounced Yahweh, trying to stick something in for the YHWH. Sometimes you might hear Yahavah. Sometimes you might hear Jehovah. This is the special, particular name for God. And what it means, where Elohim meant God above all gods. Lord, Yahweh. It means I was, I am, I continue to be faithful. It's God's personal friendship name that he gave to Moses, to give to the people of God to use at that moment in Israel's history when God rescued them from slavery to Egypt. And God parted the waters of the Red Sea so that they could escape from Pharaoh's army. And the psalmist right here at this halfway point in verse 11 is remembering God's faithful love. Because when we are at our bottom, the only way to come back up again is to remember God's faithful love for you. How do you take time to remember God's faithful love? We started doing this with our family together at the end of the day. Just before bedtime, we ask, what's something you're grateful for? And did you know that kids who grow up with a habit of gratitude grow up to be more resilient adults? It makes some sense. Because when you have that practice of gratitude, you know you have helped to overcome anything. And did you know that adults who develop a practice of gratitude also become more resilient adults? And I'm wondering, for those of you who don't have a practice of saying thank you to God, and it's so hard to start habits, isn't it? They say it takes 27 days, but I just read that's a lie. It takes 62. It's so hard to start habits. But for those of you who don't have that habit, I'm wondering, are you old enough to start a habit of remembering what God has done for you so that you can gain more resiliency? The psalmist did. The psalmist says, I will meditate on your works, Lord, Yahweh. I will ponder your deeds, the ways you've shown yourself to be faithful over and over and over. And the psalmist remembers specifically the story of how God redeemed and rescued his ancestors from slavery in Egypt. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people. You redeemed the children of Jacob and Joseph. And the psalmist remembers the power of God, even over the waters of the sea. I love the imagery here in verse 16. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and reeled. Even the deep depths shook. And the psalmist remembers the power of God to rescue God's people, parting the sea so that they could walk through. And I'm wondering, can you remember the times that God parted the sea for you? The psalmist says, your way went straight through the sea. Your pathways went right through the mighty waters, but your footprint left no trace. So they couldn't see God's footprint, but they did see God's path, and they did know that God was there. Can you name the times that God made a path for you? Can you name those times that you couldn't see God's footprints, but you knew that you were seeing God's path, and you knew that God was there? Maybe only in hindsight did you see the way God made a way for you. But as we sang a few weeks ago, God is with us. God will go before us. He will never leave us. God's been with you. God has been with you every step of your journey. God's faithful love has never run out. And I can't tell you why God doesn't stop every bad thing from happening, but I know that God is with you. We follow a God who runs to us in our suffering, not away from us. The story of Jesus is that God saw our suffering and ran to us, came close, took on flesh, and chose to suffer among us. Jesus was born as someone who was seen to the world as an illegitimate child of an unwed couple. And when Mary went into labor, they couldn't even find someone who would welcome them into their home, even among family. So she gave birth to the God of the universe in a barn with livestock. And our God in Jesus walked on the earth, got blisters on his feet, had no place to sleep at night, cried when his friend died, was betrayed by his own friends, was arrested, was tortured, was executed in the most shameful and painful way known in his day. We have a God who is familiar with suffering and invites us to cry out